"Do you know who my father is?" She sneered at the judge. But what happened next left her speechless and ruined forever. The courtroom was packed. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs, a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Everyone had heard about the case, the spoiled heiress caught in a scandal that should have been her downfall. But no one truly believed she would face any real consequences, not with the kind of money and influence her family had. Then, she walked in. Cassandra Whitmore, daughter of real estate tycoon Richard Whitmore, sauntered through the courtroom doors as if she owned the place. Dressed in a designer white suit, her blonde hair styled to perfection, she looked more suited for a press conference than a legal hearing. She didn't carry herself like someone who was about to be judged. She carried herself like someone who expected to win. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor as she approached the defendant's table. The lawyer beside her looked tense, as if he already knew what kind of disaster she was about to unleash. Cassandra, on the other hand, seemed utterly unbothered. She glanced around the room with barely veiled amusement, as if the entire trial was an inconvenience rather than a serious matter. Then her gaze landed on the judge's bench. Her lips curled slightly, amusement flickering in her eyes. Sitting in the high-backed chair was Judge Malcolm Graves, a tall, imposing black man in his late 40s. He had a reputation for being firm, fair, and absolutely unforgiving when it came to entitled defendants who thought they were above the law. Cassandra, however, didn't seem impressed. If anything, she seemed entertained. She leaned in slightly, whispering something to her lawyer, and then let out a soft laugh. The people sitting nearby noticed. A bailiff standing by the door narrowed his eyes. Someone in the jury shifted uncomfortably, but Cassandra didn't care. The judge lifted his gaze from the case files and studied her for a long moment. There was no immediate reaction, no visible sign that her disrespect had fazed him. Instead, he merely nodded once and tapped his gavel against the sound block. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice steady, "are you aware of the charges against you?" Cassandra sighed dramatically, as if she were being forced to sit through a lecture. I guess. But let's be honest, Your Honor. This is a waste of time, isn't it?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge's expression remained unreadable. Cassandra smirked. Really. A few people got upset. Some money changed hands. What's the big deal?" She gestured vaguely. "My father already handled it." It was then that something shifted. Not in the judge's face. He was as composed as ever. But a keen observer would have noticed the way his fingers tapped against the desk, just once, before he placed his hands flat in front of him. Across the room, a court clerk exchanged a glance with the prosecutor. It was subtle, but the energy in the room had changed. Someone in the back of the courtroom shifted uncomfortably. The bailiff straightened just a little. But Cassandra? She was oblivious. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with confidence. "Honestly, let's just wrap this up. My dad's waiting for me outside." She tilted her head, flashing a condescending smile. "I assume you know who he is?" Silence. The judge finally exhaled, slow and measured, as if making a decision in real time. Then, he closed the file in front of him. And for the first time since she had entered the courtroom, Cassandra's smirk faltered. Just a little. The tension in the room thickened. Judge Malcolm Graves clasped his hands together, studying the young woman before him, with the patience of a man who had seen this type of arrogance 100 times before. Cassandra Whitmore, however, was utterly convinced that she was in control. She leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, and let out a theatrical sigh. "Honestly, Your Honor, This is ridiculous. She waved a dismissive hand. I shouldn't even be here. Do you have any idea who my father is? A few gasps rippled through the spectators. Even her own lawyer stiffened beside her, his eyes darting toward the judge in alarm. Judge Graves didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply held her gaze, unshaken by her audacity. I'm well aware of who your father is, Ms. Whitmore, he said calmly. But what I need to know is whether you understand why you're sitting in that chair today. Cassandra rolled her eyes. Some overblown nonsense. A few people got upset, and now everyone's making a big deal out of nothing. She shrugged, then smirked. But don't worry, I'm sure we can work something out. Her words dripped with entitlement. A murmur spread through the audience, people whispering, shaking their heads. A young woman in the gallery clenched her fists, glaring at Cassandra as if she wanted to stand up and scream. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man in a navy blue suit, finally spoke up. Your Honor, with all due respect, the defendant's complete disregard for this trial. But Cassandra cut him off with a snort. Oh, please. What's the worst that can happen? A fine? Community service? She tilted her head toward Judge Graves, smiling sweetly. Let's just save everyone some time. I'll write a check right now. The entire courtroom went silent. Judge Graves didn't speak immediately. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping once against the desk before folding neatly again. Then his voice came, low and measured. Ms. Whitmore, do you believe that money can absolve you of responsibility? Cassandra's smirk widened. It usually does. A sharp inhale from the crowd. Someone audibly muttered, "Unbelievable." Even her lawyer was staring at her, as if she had lost her mind. Judge Graves exhaled slowly, then leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the bench. "Very well," he said. "Since you seem eager to treat this courtroom like a business transaction, let's talk numbers." Cassandra's confidence flickered, just for a fraction of a second. Judge Graves flipped through the case file, his voice steady. You were arrested for reckless endangerment, obstruction of justice, and aggravated assault against a law enforcement officer. He looked up. Charges that, under normal circumstances, could lead to prison time. Cassandra's smile faltered. But, Judge Graves continued, since you seem to think money is the answer to everything, I'd like to propose a different approach. He pulled out a document and handed it to the bailiff. This, he said, is a court order freezing all of your personal bank accounts, effective immediately. Cassandra's head snapped up. What? The murmurs in the courtroom exploded into full-on chatter. Even the prosecutor looked momentarily stunned. Judge Graves remained calm. Your assets are now under review. Additionally, I've instructed law enforcement to open an investigation into your father's financial dealings, given the evidence that has recently come to light regarding his connections to this case. Cassandra's face drained of color. You can't do that. Judge Graves didn't blink. I just did. She shot up from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You have no right. The judge's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Sit down. The command wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of authority, the weight of a man who had spent decades upholding the law. Cassandra stood frozen for a moment, her breath shallow, her fists clenched. But there was something in the way the entire courtroom was looking at her, like they were witnessing a moment she would never recover from. Slowly, stiffly, she sank back into her chair. Judge Graves nodded once. Now, let's continue. And just like that, the power in the room had shifted entirely. Cassandra Whitmore had never felt powerless a day in her life. She had grown up in penthouses and private jets, had watched her father silence people with nothing more than a phone call. She had seen judges, politicians, and police officers bend to his will, all eager to stay in his good graces. And yet, here she was, sitting in a cold, impersonal courtroom, staring at a judge who had just frozen her accounts and put her father under investigation, without so much as raising his voice. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Her fingers curled into fists against the wooden table. She could feel the weight of the entire courtroom pressing down on her, the eyes of the audience drinking in every moment of her humiliation. A few people were even smiling. She swallowed the rage burning in her throat. Number. She wasn't going to let this happen. Taking a slow breath, she forced a smirk back onto her face, her voice dripping with the same condescension as before. "This is a joke," she scoffed. "You can't just freeze my accounts. That's illegal." Judge Graves raised an eyebrow. "I assure you, Ms. Whitmore, everything I've done is well within the law." Cassandra let out a dry laugh. "Right. And I suppose this has nothing to do with some personal vendetta? What? Did my father refuse to donate to one of your little charity events?" A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even her lawyer, who had been trying, and failing, to get her to keep quiet, turned a shade paler. Judge Graves didn't flinch. He simply regarded her with the same unreadable expression, as if she were nothing more than a mildly interesting case study. "Tell me, Ms. Whitmore," he said, his voice calm, "is that truly how you see the world? That everything and everyone has a price?" Cassandra shrugged. "That's how things work." Judge Graves nodded slowly, almost as if he had expected her answer. Then he leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Then let me explain something to you." The room fell into a dead silence. "In this courtroom," he said, his voice measured, "your money means nothing. Your father's power means nothing. The only thing that matters here is the law." Cassandra rolled her eyes. "Oh, spare me the speech. My lawyer will have this thrown out before the ink dries." She flicked her gaze to her attorney. "Right?" But her lawyer, who had been sweating through his expensive suit for the past 20 minutes, refused to meet her eyes. Instead, he cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. Cassandra's stomach twisted. Number, this couldn't be happening. "Ms. Whitmore," Judge Graves continued, "I'm giving you an opportunity, one that most defendants in your position would never get. I am offering you a choice." Cassandra's nails dug into the wood. "What choice?" she snapped. Judge Graves placed his hands together. "You can either cooperate with this court and accept responsibility for your actions, or you can continue down this path and see just how deep this hole goes." The courtroom was silent, waiting. Cassandra let out a bitter laugh. "And what exactly happens if I refuse?" Judge Graves didn't answer right away. He simply reached for a stack of papers and slid them toward the bailiff. The man took them without a word and walked them over to the prosecutor's table. The prosecutor's eyes widened slightly as he skimmed the documents. Then he looked up at Cassandra, shaking his head. "Your Honor, is this—" Judge Graves nodded. "Yes." The prosecutor let out a low whistle before turning back to Cassandra. "Ms. Whitmore, I highly recommend you reconsider your approach." Cassandra's patience snapped. "Can someone explain to me what the hell is going on?" Judge Graves steepled his fingers. "Those," he said, nodding to the papers, "are newly uncovered financial records. They detail a series of transactions that link your father's company to several illegal offshore accounts." Cassandra's entire body went cold. "That, combined with the evidence we've gathered from your recent arrest, paints a rather damning picture." She couldn't breathe. Her father. His business. The thing that had always been untouchable. Number. She forced herself to straighten. You're bluffing. Judge Graves didn't blink. Am I? Her hands were shaking now. This is insane. My father will never. Your father, Judge Graves interrupted, is not in this courtroom. You are. And for the first time since she walked through those doors, Cassandra Whitmore finally understood. Her last name wouldn't save her. Her money wouldn't save her. No one was coming to her rescue. She was alone. For the first time in her life, Cassandra Whitmore was speechless. She sat frozen, her mind racing, trying to piece together an escape plan. There had to be a way out. There was always a way out. Her father always made things disappear. Problems, scandals, even people. But this wasn't just some PR nightmare that could be buried under a few headlines and a fat check. This was real. Judge Graves watched her in silence, giving her a moment to let reality sink in. His patience wasn't out of kindness. It was the patience of a man who knew exactly when his opponent had lost and was simply waiting for them to realize it too. Cassandra's throat tightened. You can't do this, she whispered. Judge Graves tilted his head. Do what exactly? She swallowed hard. Ruin me. His gaze remained steady. I didn't ruin you, Ms. Whitmore. You did that yourself. A sharp silence settled over the courtroom. Cassandra's nails dug into her palms. My father will fix this, she spat, her voice laced with desperation. He'll make one phone call, and this whole thing will disappear. Judge Graves exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Your father, he said, his voice calm but firm, was arrested an hour ago. Cassandra's breath hitched. No. The investigation into his company uncovered more than just financial crimes. He tapped the stack of documents on his desk. Bribery, fraud, witness intimidation. His gaze hardened. This case isn't just about you anymore, Ms. Whitmore. It never was. Cassandra's head spun. Her father, untouchable, unstoppable, was sitting in a jail cell. She shook her head violently, as if she could will the truth away. No, this isn't happening, she muttered. This isn't happening. The courtroom remained deadly silent. Judge Graves leaned back. Ms. Whitmore, he said, his voice measured, do you have anything to say before I deliver my verdict? Cassandra's lips parted, but no words came. She had nothing. No threats, no bargaining chips, no power. The weight of the moment crashed down on her all at once, suffocating. For the first time in her life, she had no control. Judge Graves studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. Cassandra Whitmore, for your crimes, I hereby sentence you to... A loud sob broke the air. The entire courtroom turned. Cassandra had her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking. The arrogance, the entitlement, the unshakable confidence. It was all gone. She wasn't a powerful heiress anymore. She wasn't the daughter of an untouchable billionaire. She was just a scared girl in a courtroom, facing the consequences of a life she had never thought would catch up to her. Judge Graves let the silence hang for a moment longer before delivering the final blow. You will serve 5 years in federal prison, he said. No bail, no special treatment. Cassandra gasped. And when you get out, he continued, your last name will mean nothing. She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale with horror. No. Judge Graves met her gaze with unwavering finality. This courtroom does not serve the privileged, Ms. Whitmore, he said. It serves justice. And with that, he slammed the gavel down. The sound of the gavel echoed through the silent courtroom like a final, irreversible judgment. Cassandra Whitmore sat motionless, her face pale, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled from the weight of her own downfall. 5 years. No bail. No way out. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some whispered in shock, others in satisfaction. For too long, people like her had walked away untouched, their wealth shielding them from consequences. But not today. Not this time. 2 officers approached her. "Ms. Whitmore," one of them said, his voice firm. "It's time to go." She flinched at the words. Time to go. But not to a luxury car or a private jet. Not to a high-rise penthouse overlooking the city. To prison. Her legs trembled as she stood. Her once arrogant posture was gone, replaced by a hollow, stunned silence. Her hands, which had once held designer handbags and champagne glasses, were now being pulled behind her back. The cold steel of the handcuffs locked around her wrists with a decisive click. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. No more privilege, no more immunity. As she was led past the spectators, she could feel their eyes on her, some pitying, some relishing the moment. She saw the young woman from earlier, the one who had clenched her fists at Cassandra's arrogance. But now, there was no anger in her gaze, only quiet vindication. Cassandra turned to Judge Graves one last time, desperation flickering in her tear-streaked eyes. But he had already moved on, already opening the next case file, already returning to the business of justice. Because that's what this was. Just another case, another name on a docket. Cassandra Whitmore, for the first time in her life, was just another defendant. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Cassandra Whitmore, sealing her fate as the officers led her away. The once arrogant heiress, who had walked in with the belief that the world revolved around her, was now just another inmate awaiting her sentence. Judge Malcolm Graves exhaled, his fingers resting on the gavel as he watched her disappear from sight. For him, this was just another case, another example of justice taking its rightful course. But for the people in that room, it was something more. It was proof that power and privilege couldn't always bend the law. The courtroom began to empty. Spectators whispered among themselves, some still in shock at what they had witnessed, others nodding in satisfaction. The prosecutor gathered his files, exchanging glances with the defense attorney, who looked as if he had aged 10 years in a single hour. Near the back of the room, a young woman who had once been a victim of Cassandra's recklessness wiped away a single tear. Not of sadness, but of relief. Judge Graves stood, adjusting his robe, before walking toward his chambers. Another case closed, another reminder that justice, no matter how delayed, always found its way. What do you think? Was this the right verdict? Should Cassandra have received a harsher sentence, or was this punishment enough? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because in the world of justice, every story has its reckoning.